The St. Joseph Hall glowed with lamplight, warm and golden against the Montana winter night. Violins screamed joyfully as boots pounded the wooden floor, laughter bouncing off the walls in waves. Couples spun and swayed, skirts brushing polished boards, glasses clinking at the edges of the room. Near the drinks table, a woman stood alone. Mabel Thornton had been there for 3 hours. No partner, no invitation, just a brown dress that no tailor in town would sell her anything nicer than, and a polite smile that grew heavier with every passing song. Snickers drifted through the crowd like smoke. Heads leaned together. Judgments were passed quietly, comfortably. Then the doors slammed open. Cold air rushed in, extinguishing a few candles near the entrance. Every head turned. Gideon Wolfe stepped inside. He was nearly 7 feet tall. Shoulders broad as a plow beam, his white linen shirt stretched tight across a body built by mountains rather than mirrors. His beard was thick, his hair pulled back, his presence so heavy the room seemed to tilt toward him. In his hand he held a single red rose. He walked straight across the hall, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the sudden silence. He stopped in front of Mabel, and then he spoke. "You're the most beautiful woman in this room," Gideon said, his voice calm and steady. "And I don't care who disagrees." For half a second, no one breathed. Then laughter exploded behind him. "Wolfe, are you drunk?" someone shouted. "All the women in town, and you pick that fat one?" Gideon didn't turn around. He didn't raise his voice. He only looked at Mabel as if the hall, the music, the cruelty simply did not exist. The violin song ended. The room went still. And then Gideon Wolfe did something no one in St. Joseph would ever forget. He knelt down on the dance floor. What made the town fall silent wasn't the kneeling, it was why he dared to kneel. That rose wasn't bought from a shop. It was the only one he'd found growing wild on the mountain. And Gideon Wolfe hated crowds, hated judgment, hated being seen. So why tonight? Why her? Before we rewind to understand why a mountain man would offer his only rose to the woman the entire town mocked, tell me this. Where are you right now? And what are you doing as this story begins? Because 6 months earlier, Mabel Thornton arrived in St. Joseph with a small hope. And this town crushed it the same way it was trying to crush her now. 6 months earlier, in August of 1880, Mabel Thornton arrived in St. Joseph with a single suitcase and a teaching certificate that still smelled faintly of fresh ink. She came from Missouri, from a house where every conversation about her future ended the same way. There was a widower twice her age who needed a wife. He had land, he had means, and, as her mother put it without malice, no one else would want a girl shaped like her. When Mabel refused, the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. So she left. Montana, she had been told, was a place for new beginnings, a place where effort mattered more than appearance, a place still being built. St. Joseph looked promising at first. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with saloons loud with confidence, a tailor shop with shining windows, and a white church standing at the center like a reminder of order. It felt like the kind of town that believed it knew exactly what it was. Mabel went straight to the schoolhouse. The education board listened politely while she spoke about her training, her scores, her love for teaching children to read. Then one man leaned back in his chair and looked her up and down. "We do need a teacher," he said carefully, "but someone more professional." Mabel understood the word immediately. She tried the saloon next. The owner didn't bother lowering his voice. Customers didn't want to see someone like her serving drinks. The tailor waved her out before she could finish asking about work, muttering that she would ruin the image of the shop. By the end of the week, the only job left was one no one wanted. She washed dishes at Thornhill Restaurant from 10 at night until 4 in the morning. How long after laughter had faded from the dining room? The water was always cold. Her hands stayed red and cracked. Grease soaked into her clothes no matter how often she scrubbed them. She slept in a narrow room behind the church, allowed there by Pastor Jenkins as an act of charity. He was kind in the way men often were when kindness cost them nothing. Mabel was grateful anyway. Her days passed in shadow. She walked early and late to avoid attention. She kept her eyes down. She learned the rhythm of whispered judgments and practiced pretending she couldn't hear them. St. Joseph was not openly cruel. It didn't have to be. It operated on quiet agreement, on who belonged and who did not, on who was seen and who was tolerated. Mabel existed at the very bottom of that unspoken ladder. Still, she did not leave. Each night, as she scrubbed plates alone, she reminded herself why she had come. Teaching was not just a job to her. It was proof that she had something to offer, beyond what people saw at first glance. She held on to that belief even as it grew thinner with each passing week. What Mabel did not know was that someone had noticed her long before the town decided she was invisible. Someone who came to Thornhill through the back door. Someone who never laughed with the others. Someone who stood quietly in the shadows, watching her wipe tears away before she thought anyone could see. And that someone was not the pastor, not a councilman, not a man who fit easily into St. Joseph at all. He was a mountain man, nearly 7 feet tall, who appeared at the restaurant's rear entrance on the night Mabel came closest to breaking. 10 miles from St. Joseph, high in the Bitterroot Range, Gideon Wolfe lived where noise could not follow. His cabin sat wedged between pine and stone, built by his own hands, far enough from the town that its judgments never reached him unless he chose to descend. He hunted elk and deer, trapped in winter, sold hides twice a month, and returned to the mountains before anyone could ask questions. Most people in St. Joseph knew him only as a shape in a doorway, a massive man who spoke little and left early. They feared him without understanding why. Gideon was nearly 7 feet tall, his frame carved by labor rather than intention. His beard was thick, his hands scarred, his movements economical and controlled. His eyes were dark and steady, the kind that unsettled people because they did not flinch or seek approval. But the most dangerous thing about Gideon Wolfe was not his size. It was what he carried. In 1869, long before the mountains became his refuge, Gideon had been something else entirely. He was 22 and living in Denver, newly licensed, proud of the title he had earned through years of study and discipline. He designed structures, bridges mostly, things meant to last, things meant to carry people safely from one place to another. The Arkansas River Bridge was supposed to be his future. The company overseeing construction, run by a man named Harrison Locke, cut corners without telling him. Inferior materials, falsified reports. Gideon trusted the paperwork because he trusted the system, because he believed that rules existed to protect lives. On the day the bridge opened, the town gathered to celebrate. families crossed together. Our children ran ahead, laughing. Then the supports gave way. The bridge collapsed in seconds. 35 people died. Gideon pulled 7 from the water with his own hands, his arms tearing, his lungs burning. Among the bodies dragged from the river was a girl named Emily, 10 years old. She had waved at him earlier that morning, proud to be part of something new. She died before help could arrive. The investigation was swift and cruel. Locke disappeared behind lawyers. Evidence shifted. Blame landed where it was easiest. Gideon lost his license, his reputation, and any chance at defending himself in the court of public opinion. But what destroyed him was not the verdict. It was the certainty that his work had killed a child. He never designed another structure, never held a pencil to paper for that purpose again. He left Denver and walked into the mountains with one belief burned into him. Anything he built would eventually collapse. Living alone was safer. Safer for him. Safer for everyone else. For 12 years, he kept that promise to himself. Until the night he heard crying behind Thornhill Restaurant. Gideon had come down the mountain to sell hides. He was leaving through the alley when the sound stopped him. Not loud, controlled, someone trying not to be heard. He looked through the small kitchen window and saw a woman sitting on the floor, knees drawn tight to her chest, shoulders shaking as she cried in silence. It was Mabel. He had seen her before, always working late, always alone. He noticed the way others avoided looking at her, the way she made herself small without ever asking for pity. That night, something inside him broke open. It wasn't attraction, not at first. It was recognition. The sound she made was the same sound he had made years ago, kneeling beside a river, knowing something precious was gone and that no apology would ever be enough. When he knocked on the back door, he was breaking the longest promise of his life, the promise to stay distant, to never step into another person's pain, because pain, once shared, demanded action, and Gideon Wolfe no longer trusted himself to act without destroying what he touched. But as he stood there, listening to Mabel's breathing steady, as she wiped her face and opened the door, one truth cut through his fear. Leaving her alone felt worse than staying. Mabel opened the back door with hesitation written across her face. The man standing there filled the narrow alley with his presence. He was broader than anyone she had ever seen, his coat dusted with snow, his beard dark and untamed. For a heartbeat, fear flickered in her eyes, not because he looked violent, but because he looked like someone who did not belong to the small, predictable cruelties she understood. "I'm sorry," Gideon said, his voice low and careful. "I didn't mean to startle you." Mabel tightened her grip on the doorframe. "The restaurant's closed." "I know," he replied. "I heard crying." She straightened immediately. "I'm fine." Gideon's eyes moved past her, just enough to see the stacks of plates, the raw redness of her hands, the water in the sink gone cloudy and cold. When he looked back at her, his expression didn't soften with pity. It sharpened with concern. "You're not," he said. The words landed harder than she expected. For weeks, months, no one had acknowledged what she carried, not out loud, not directly. Mabel felt her throat tighten. "I don't need help," she said, though her voice betrayed her. Gideon hesitated, then made a decision that surprised even himself. "Do you want me to help you wash the dishes?" Mabel blinked. "What?" "I can do the work," he said simply. "I've got strong hands and nowhere else to be." She studied him, searching for mockery, for condescension. Finding none only unsettled her further. Why would you do that? Gideon thought of a frozen river, of a small body carried out of the water, of years spent convincing himself that distance was the same as virtue. "Because no one should have to do this alone in the cold," he said. The silence that followed was long and fragile. Finally, Mabel stepped aside. They worked without speaking at first. Gideon rolled up his sleeves and took to the sink as if it were any other labor. He didn't rush. He didn't complain. The plates disappeared faster than Mabel expected, and with each one the weight in her chest eased just slightly. When they finished, it was nearly 3 in the morning. Gideon dried his hands and nodded toward the door. "I come into town every Friday," he said. "If you want, I can help again." Mabel wasn't sure why she said yes. Maybe because he hadn't asked for gratitude. Maybe because for the first time since arriving in St. Joseph, someone had stayed. He came back the next week, and the week after that. 4 months passed like that. Every Friday night, Gideon appeared at the back door. They washed dishes. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Mabel spoke of her hope to teach, of the children she imagined helping one day. Gideon spoke only in fragments about Denver, about work he no longer did. What Mabel did not know was that every visit cost him something. Each step into the restaurant pulled him closer to people. Each shared silence chipped away at the wall he had built to protect the world from himself. Gideon had sworn never to create anything again, never to be responsible for another fragile thing. But every week, as he stood beside Mabel in the warm kitchen light, he felt that vow weakening, and he did not stop himself. By the time winter settled fully over St. Joseph, their Fridays had become a quiet ritual. Gideon arrived after dark, snow still clinging to his coat, and knocked twice on the back door of Thornhill. Mabel always opened it with the same small pause, as if making sure he was real. They worked shoulder to shoulder at the sink, the sound of water and clinking plates filling the spaces where words weren't necessary. In that narrow kitchen, away from eyes and judgment, something fragile but steady took shape. At first, they spoke only of safe things, the weather, the price of flour, how many plates had broken that night. But safety, Gideon learned, was a temporary condition. Mabel began to talk about teaching, not complaints, not bitterness, but dreams spoken carefully, as if saying them too loudly might make them disappear. She described rows of children learning their letters, the look on a child's face when understanding finally arrived. Gideon listened the way he always did, fully, without interruption. He never offered solutions. He only remembered. In return, he told her almost nothing. He said he had lived in Denver once, that he had worked with his hands, that he preferred the mountains because they didn't ask questions. It was enough for a while. Outside the kitchen, St. Joseph was paying attention. Someone noticed the mountain man appearing after hours. Someone else noticed that Mabel no longer cried in the alley before walking home. Jokes started, quiet at first, then louder. Speculation hardened into rumor. People didn't need proof. They needed a story that made sense to them. Mabel felt it tightening around her like a net. She heard it in the saloon when she passed too close to the door. She saw it in the way the tailor's wife stared openly now, no longer bothering with pretense. Once a man laughed and asked her how much the mountain brute paid her for company. She kept walking, but the words followed her all the way back to the church room. That night, she tried to send Gideon away. "You shouldn't come any more," she said quietly as they stood at the sink. "People are talking." Gideon looked at her hands, red and raw in the water. "Let them." "It's different for you," she said. "They already think you're strange. I don't want them to ruin what little peace you have." Gideon didn't answer right away. He finished washing the plate in his hands, set it down carefully, and turned to face her. "I decide where I stand," he said, "not them." Mabel swallowed. Part of her wanted to believe him. Another part had learned the cost of being visible. "I don't want you dragged down because of me." He shook his head once. "You're not dragging me anywhere. I'm choosing this." The words stayed with her long after he left. As winter deepened, the nights grew harsher. One Friday in January, snow fell so heavily it swallowed sound itself. Thornhill was nearly empty, and the owner let Mabel leave the dining room early to start the dishes. Gideon arrived late, breath fogging in the doorway, his coat stiff with ice. They worked faster that night, the cold pressing in even through the kitchen walls. When they finished, Gideon stayed, leaning against the counter instead of heading for the door. "Can I ask you something?" Mabel said, surprising herself. He nodded. "What did you do before the mountains?" The question hung between them, heavier than steam. Gideon's eyes dropped to the floor. His hands flexed, then stilled. For a long moment, Mabel thought she had pushed too far. She opened her mouth to apologize. "I built bridges," he said. She waited. "In Denver," he continued, his voice low. "That was my work." Her heart skipped. "You were an engineer?" "Architect," he corrected. "Or I was." The way he said it made her careful. "Why did you stop?" Gideon closed his eyes. When he spoke again, the words came slowly, as if each one had to be lifted out of him. He told her about the river, the celebration, the sound of wood breaking where steel should have been. He told her about the screams, about the weight of bodies pulled from the water. He told her about Emily, small and smiling, and how she had waved at him hours before dying. Mabel pressed a hand to her mouth. "I should have known," Gideon said. "I should have checked again. If I had, she'd be alive." Tears ran down his face, unguarded, unstoppable. He didn't wipe them away. "I don't build anymore," he finished, "because everything I build falls apart." The kitchen felt very small. Mabel stepped closer without thinking and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, scarred, warm. "That bridge didn't fall because of you," she said gently. "It carried my name," he replied. She took a breath, steadying herself. "You built your cabin, Gideon. It's standing. You built a place where you survive." "That's different," he said. "No one depends on it." She met his eyes. "I do." The word landed between them undeniable. "You come every week," she continued. "You listen. You help. You stay. You built something with me, whether you meant to or not." He stared at her as if she had shifted the ground beneath his feet. "Maybe building isn't what you're afraid of," she said. "Maybe it's losing what you build." Gideon said nothing. But something in his expression changed, subtle and profound. From that night on, their connection was no longer hidden even from themselves. The rumors grew louder. By February, St. Joseph buzzed with anticipation for the Valentine social. The hall was decorated, Music rehearsed, flowers ordered. It was the kind of event that made lines visible. Who belonged, who did not. Mabel hesitated before deciding to go. Pastor Jenkins encouraged her, insisting that everyone was welcome. She told herself that standing alone was better than hiding. The night arrived cold and clear. Mabel dressed carefully, choosing her best brown dress, smoothing fabric that never quite looked right no matter how much care she gave it. She arrived early and stood by the drinks table, hands folded, watching couples claim the floor. Minutes stretched into hours. No one asked her to dance. She felt eyes slide over her, away from her, through her. Laughter rippled nearby, never quite directed at her, but always close enough to sting. She told herself she would leave after the next song, then the next, then the next. 3 hours passed. Outside, Gideon stood in the snow, staring at the lit windows of the hall. He had sworn never to enter places like this again. Crowds still smelled like panic, like blame. In his hand he held a single red rose he had found growing wild near a frozen creek. It wasn't perfect. One petal was torn, but it was real. If you were him, what would you do? Turn away, protect yourself, and let the night pass, or step into the room that once destroyed you and risk being seen again? Gideon took a breath and pushed the door open, and St. Joseph would never be the same. The moment Gideon crossed the threshold of the hall, the past rose up to meet him. The sound hit first. Laughter layered over music, the scrape of boots on wood, the low hum of a crowd that believed itself safe in numbers. For a heartbeat, he was no longer in St. Joseph. He was back in Denver, standing at the edge of a river, hearing cheers turn into screams. His chest tightened. His fingers curled reflexively, as if bracing for something to collapse. He almost turned around. Then he saw Mabel. She stood exactly where she had been standing for hours, near the drinks table, her shoulders drawn inward, her posture practiced in endurance. She smiled politely at someone who wasn't looking at her, then let the smile fade when she realized she was alone again. Something in Gideon settled. This was not pity. This was choice. The town saw a joke forming, a mountain brute wandering in from the cold. A woman they had already decided did not count. To them, it was a spectacle waiting to happen. To Gideon, it was a line in the ground. He took one step forward, then another, each footfall heavy against the floor. With every stride he felt eyes on him, felt whispers coil and sharpen. This was the fear he had avoided for 12 years, the fear of being seen, of being judged, of being blamed if anything went wrong. He reminded himself why he was here. Mabel had not asked to be saved. She had not asked for rescue or spectacle. She had only asked to be treated as if she mattered. When he reached her, the noise of the hall seemed to dull, as if the room itself were holding its breath. He spoke the words clearly, without performance, without apology. "You are the most beautiful woman in this room, and I don't care who disagrees." The reaction came instantly. Laughter, sharp and relieved. Men leaning back in their chairs, women covering smiles with gloved hands. It was easier to laugh than to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Gideon did not respond to them. He turned fully to Mabel. For a flicker of a second, she looked terrified, not of him, but of what this moment might cost. She had learned, painfully, that attention was rarely kind. He held out the rose. "One dance," he said, "only if you want to." The choice was hers. That mattered. Mabel looked down at the flower, at the imperfect petals, at the large, steady hand, offering it without expectation. Then she looked up at Gideon and saw something she recognized. Not confidence, not dominance, resolve. "I want to," she said softly. The laughter thinned, replaced by murmurs, as Gideon guided her toward the center of the floor. He placed his hand at her waist with deliberate care, leaving space, asking without words. When she stepped closer, he adjusted, matching her rhythm, not leading with force, but with attention. They began to dance. It was not graceful in the way the town admired. It was quiet, measured, honest. Gideon moved as if every step mattered, as if he were building something invisible between them that required precision and trust. As they turned, he leaned down just enough for her to hear him. "I need you to know something," he said. "I didn't come here because I felt sorry for you." Mabel swallowed. "Then why?" "Because you were the first person who showed me that building something doesn't always mean losing it," he said. "You let me believe I could create something good again." Her breath caught. "I'm not special," she whispered. "I'm not what this town wants." Gideon slowed, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are kind when it would be easier to harden. You show up even when no one welcomes you. You didn't run when you saw what I was carrying." He paused, letting the words land. "That makes you extraordinary." The music drew to a close. The hall waited. Gideon stepped back, then did the thing that would echo through St. Joseph long after the night ended. He lowered himself onto one knee, right there on the dance floor, in front of everyone who had laughed. "I don't have a ring," he said, "and I don't promise ease, but if you'll have me, I want to build a life with you, carefully, together." The silence was complete. Mabel felt the weight of every eye in the room, then felt it lift as she realized something else. For the first time, she was not alone in it. She nodded, tears spilling freely. "Yes," she said. And in that moment, Gideon Wolfe made another decision that frightened him even more than stepping into the hall. He would pick up a pencil again. A year later, the Bitterroot Mountains sounded different. Not quieter, but fuller. Hammer strikes echoed through the valley in steady rhythm, not frantic, not rushed. Gideon worked slowly now, measuring twice before every cut, testing each joint with patient hands. The structure rising from the ground was modest, low and wide, built to bend with winter rather than fight it. No grand arches, no daring spans, just strong beams, honest angles, and room enough for voices. Mabel stood nearby, sleeves rolled, chalk dust smudged on her fingers. Inside the finished room, rough benches faced a simple board fixed to the wall. Sunlight spilled through wide windows Gideon had placed deliberately, so children would never have to strain to see. The school opened in late spring. Children arrived from scattered homesteads, some barefoot, some shy, some loud with curiosity. Mabel greeted each one by name, her voice steady, her posture no longer folded inward. She taught them letters, numbers, stories of the land they lived on. She taught them that learning was not a privilege reserved for the narrow or the admired. Gideon watched from the doorway more than once, a quiet smile settling into lines that had once known only tension, each nail driven straight, each wall standing firm, chipped away at the fear that had ruled him for so long. Nothing collapsed. But not the roof, not the walls, not the life they were building. In the evenings, the valley filled with softer sounds, children laughing as they ran downhill, Mabel's voice drifting through open windows, the wind moving through pine like breath. On Valentine's Day, Gideon still brought her a rose, not always red, not always perfect, but always real. And every time Mabel smiled without lowering her eyes. A year after the night St. Joseph fell silent, the mountains no longer felt like an escape. They felt like home. Gideon and Mabel lived higher up the Bitterroot slope now, where the wind carried fewer voices and no one arrived by accident. Their cabin stood firm against winter storms, its lines simple, deliberate, built with a care Gideon had once believed himself incapable of offering the world. Life there was not easy, but it was honest. Mabel woke each morning with purpose. Children arrived from distant homesteads, boots muddy, faces bright with curiosity. She taught them to read, to count, to question. She stood at the board without shrinking, without apology. For the first time in her life, she was not waiting to be allowed space. Gideon worked nearby, designing and building with restraint. No grand spans, no risks taken for pride. Every beam was tested, every structure planned for safety before beauty. He learned that building did not have to mean danger, and that care was not weakness. The school did not collapse. Neither did they. Word traveled slowly, as it always did in the mountains. People spoke of the quiet teacher who never raised her voice, and the mountain man who had once terrified a town simply by choosing love in public. Some listened. Some did not. Gideon no longer needed them to. On cold evenings, smoke rose from the chimney and light spilled across the snow. Inside, Mabel graded lessons while Gideon sharpened tools. Their life was not watched. It did not need witnesses. It simply stood. Out here, where judgment often travels faster than kindness, St. Joseph learned a lesson it never set out to learn. Courage does not always come with fists or fury. Sometimes it walks into a room, speaks one honest sentence, and refuses to pretend it is smaller than it is. Gideon Wolfe did not silence the town by force. He did it by choosing openly and standing still. Mabel Thornton did not become strong because the world finally approved of her, but because she stopped waiting for permission to exist. Some things break so we can learn how to build again, properly, carefully, together. And now, as this story closes, tell me this. Where are you right now, and what are you doing as you reach the end of this story? Tell me in the comments.